Welcome to segment 2 on our lecture on photography and realism. In the first part, we talked about photography. Now we're going to be looking at some paintings in the movement of realism. As you could probably sense from our last discussion, that realism does become a platform, especially for social reform. Social reformers were influenced by a concept called positivism, Positivism, and this was introduced by Auguste Comte. I'm probably saying his name wrong. And this was a theory allowing that all knowledge must come from proven ideas based on science or scientific theory. Comte said that only tested concepts can be accepted as truths. Key 19th century thinkers like Charles Darwin and Karl Marx added to the spirit of positivism by exploring theories about human evolution and social equality. These efforts shook traditional thinking and created a clamor in intellectual circles. New inventions such as the telephone, motion pictures, as we see with Muybridge with his motion stills, bicycles and automobiles become smaller, and the world begins opening communication to a wider audience. Also, artists understood these powerful changes by exchanging traditional beliefs for something called the Avant-Garde. This is another term that you should be familiar with, Avantgarde, and this was a word coined during this time. The academies, so carefully set up in the 18th century, were abandoned in the late 19th century. We'll also start to see galleries, commercial galleries, pop up. Artists used the past for inspirations but rejected traditional subject matter. So we don't really see religious subjects, we don't really see a lot of aristocratic portraits or history paintings and scenes from mythology. What we do see instead is the spirit of modernism, and this is something that artists chose to represent. So we'll start to see peasant scenes, landscapes, and still lifes. Systematic and scientific archaeology began during this period as well, with excavations in Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. And this also is something that will influence artists. So what you're looking at is Courbet, who is a French painter, and this is known as the Stonebreakers, done in 1849. Courbet was quoted as saying, "Show me an angel and I'll paint one." And this really does sum up the realist philosophy inspired by the positivism movement. Realist painters believed in painting things that one could experience with the five senses, which often translated into painting the lower class in their environment. Usually peasants were depicted with reverence, their daily lives touched with a basic honesty and sincerity thought to be missing among the middle and upper classes. And so often you'll see these peasants being depicted with the earth and the landscape. However, Courbet takes his a bit further. So this painting was painted only 1 year after Karl Marx's and Frederick Engels wrote their influential pamphlets, the Communist Manifesto. And if we look closely at Courbet's painting in the Stonebreakers, we see the artist's concern for the plight of the poor, and it's very evident. Here we see two figures labor to break and remove stones from a road that is being built. In our age of powerful jackhammers and bulldozers, such work is reserved as punishment for chain gangs. We don't really have those anymore, but that's not too far removed from our history. So this work is obviously very grueling, very laboring. It's not something that people enjoy doing. This is a depiction. This is a contemporary of Courbet. This is Millet, another French painter, called the Gleaners. Unlike Millet, who in his painting, here, the Gleaners, was known for depicting hard-working but idealized peasants. Courbet depicts figures who wear ripped and tattered clothing, and unlike the aerial perspective Millet used in the Gleaners, he really brings our eye into the French countryside during the Gleaners to bring our eye deep into the French countryside during the harvest. So when we look at these two paintings, they're very different. They're depicting the same subject matter, the poor, laborers, farmers. Millet's is definitely much more idealized and kind of romanticizes the notion of the farmer and working the land, and even the figures, sort of bent over, and these curves are very graceful, and the atmospheric perspective that he uses. When we look at Courbet's, it is different. You do see the tattered clothing. We don't really see the faces of the figures. They become more anonymous to us. And we also see a lot of detail and surface texture being emphasized. The two stonebreakers in Courbet's painting are set against a low hill on a sort of common rural French town called Ornans, Ornans, where the artist had been raised and continued to spend much of his time. The hill reaches to the top of the canvas, everywhere but the upper right corner, where a teeny patch of blue sky appears. And this is what they're referring to up here. This effect is to isolate the laborers and to suggest that they are physically and economically trapped. In Millet's painters, the Gleaners, the rounded backs echo one another, creating a composition that feels unified, where Courbet's figures seem disjointed. Millet's painting, for all its sympathy for these poor figures, could still be read as art by viewers at an exhibition in Paris. So this was considered more artful. Courbet wants to show us what is real, and so he has depicted a man that seems too old and a boy that seems too young for such backbreaking labor. This is not meant to be heroic. It's meant to be an accurate account of the abuse and deprivation that was a common feature of mid-century French rural life. And with so many great works of art, there's a close affiliation between the narrative and the formal choices made by the painter, meaning elements such as brushwork, composition, line, and color really play in to the social awareness theme of the poor. Like the stones themselves, Courbet's brushwork is rough, more so than might be expected during the mid-19th century. This suggests that the way the artist painted his canvas was in part a conscious rejection of the highly polished, refined neoclassical style that still dominated French art in 1848. Perhaps most characteristic of his style is his refusal to focus on parts of the image that would usually receive the most attention. Traditionally, an artist would spend the most time on the hands, face, and foreground. Not Courbet. If you look carefully, you will notice he attempts to be very even-handed, attending to faces and rocks equally. In this way, the stonebreaker seems to lack the basics of art. Things like composition that selects and organizes, aerial perspective and finish, and as a result, it does feel more real. And, it does. It really does come across more like a photograph. So this was submitted to the Salon of 1851. It was different because of this notion of poverty being emphasized, and relaying the idea that these figures were born poor, and based on, compositional choices, they will remain poor their whole lives. Again, this sort of reaction to, labor, and workers really trying to demand better working conditions. This is a large-scale painting, and remember, large-scale paintings were usually reserved for sort of these grand historical paintings, history paintings, and here we see that the scale of the painting is now elevating the commonplace, and these sort of genre scenes as important and worthy of being viewed that way. Let's see. So, very important movement and piece in the realism movement. This is, and these are Courbet's words in which he described how he began working on the painting. I stopped to consider two men breaking stones on the highway. It's rare to meet the most complete expressions of poverty, so an idea of a picture came to me on the spot. I made an appointment with them at my studio for the next day. On the one side is an old man, 70. On the other side is a young fellow in his filthy, tattered shirt. Alas, in labor such as this, one's life begins that way and ends the same way. So now that we've actually gotten some art history under our belt, some cross-cultural comparisons in terms of genre scenes, other genre scenes that we've looked at in earlier historical periods. You might want to look back at Vermeer's Woman Holding a Balance, and in the High Renaissance, North Renaissance, Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow. So those are two images that you might want to cross-reference and sort of compare and contrast with this image. All right, so we're moving on to some other landscape paintings. This is an artist, Rosa Maria Velasco. So there was an academy of San Carlos that was established in Mexico City, and so this was one of the first art schools in the Americas in the late 19th century. Creole artists, and these are artists of European descent born in the Spanish Americas in preceding decades, had failed to convince the Spanish king to create a pedagogical artist institution. Nevertheless, by the end of the 18th century, the Royal Academy of San Carlos was established. It was modeled after the Art Academy of San Fernando in Madrid, and consequently became a new chapter of Mexican art history. This important school fostered romantic and neoclassical aesthetics through previously unexplored genres of painting. For example, beginning in the 19th century, students emerging from the new school at the academy began to illustrate local vistas of the Valley of Mexico. The development of these images offered the perfect opportunity for artists to explore the romantic qualities of pure landscape, which in Mexico, through the teachings of the Italian professor Eugene Landy, emerged as a popular genre in the academy. However, and as observed in Velasco's The Valley of Mexico from the hillside of Santa Isabel, which is what you are looking at right now, the valley represented much more than a mere opportunity to practice this newly established genre of painting. This imagery offered an opportunity to highlight symbols of patriotism valuable to a new independent society. So again, we see this movement of making the landscape becoming something more meaningful, and not just a pretty image. After the 1821 War of Independence from Spain, Mexico sought to establish its identity through artistic endeavors. The development of the practice of national landscape painting was part of the dictator López de Santa Anna's efforts to reestablish the Art Academy after decades of neglect following the formation of Mexico as an independent nation. The Italian artist Eugene Landy, who was a well-regarded artist in Mexico, was appointed as the Academy's professor of perspective and landscape painting in 1855. His mentorship and his experience uniting ancient and contemporary Roman historical subjects in his canvases forever changed the history of Mexican landscape painting. And so this is one of his landscapes, the Valley of Mexico from the hill of Tenayo, done in 1870. So this is the painting that we are concerned with. While Eugene Landy and his contemporaries had created similar landscapes of the valley, the Mexico Valley that you see here, another artist presented a monumentality and open quality to her images that surpassed compositions like Eugene Landiezo's. Look at some details of this. So Velasco's compositions united pre-Hispanic symbols and contemporary national sentiments. For example, this is a close-up of this painting. This is Velasco's painting. The white peaks that predominate the vistas are these very well-known volcanoes. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but they are spelled Popocatepetl, and the other one is Iztaccchihuatl, volcanoes. For centuries, the land's romantic typography had captured the imaginations of Mexicans. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish to the Valley of Mexico in 1519, these two volcanoes were the main characters of a legendary ill-fated love between an Aztec princess and a courageous warrior. And I have their official names in the lecture notes when you go back to review this. So here we see the artist, trying to incorporate or infuse, this idea of European landscape painting with this, this indigenous culture of Mexico, or the territory of Mexico, and relating back to the Aztec history as well. And this notion of this sort of Aztec history is something that Mexicans will come to embrace and sort of see as their nationality. This is another detail of the same painting, and this is actually a detail of the Basilica Guadalupe, which you can see in the bottom left at the edge of Lake Texcoco. Remember, this was the lake, and we saw that the Aztec city had this as part of their iconography, and the frontispiece of Mendoza that we looked at when we were looking at art from the colonial Americas, or art from from New Spain. So towards the composition's background, the spectator can admire the receding waters of Lake Texcoco and the contours of Mexico City. The ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was founded in the middle of this lake in 1325. This was a familiar sight for Velasco, given that the artist's home was located at the foot of the small hill shown in the middle of the canvas. This unassuming hill was also an important sacred colonial site where the Virgin Guadalupe first appeared to the indigenous man Juan Diego in 1531, so that should be familiar to you. The artist is known to have painted in this location many times. This version of the Valley of Mexico from the hillside of Santa Isabel is perhaps most celebrated of a dozen or so images with the same subject done by the artist between 1875 and 1892. At one point, the brushstrokes that form the peaks of the snow-covered volcanoes, the rock formations, and other details were done from memory, making it possible for the artist to change and manipulate the details of the landscape as the artist saw fit. This is a landscape painting done by a German artist. So the Valley of Mexico can be viewed as a reinterpretation of the common late 18th century German subject pastoral Idylls, Idylls, where a sense of poetic harmony and daily life were united into the landscape. And this is in the tradition of artists such as Caspar David Friedrich, which is his image that you're looking at here. And so this was an influence in Velasco's painting technique as well. We're going to look at some details of the figure in the foreground. So Velasco introduces his figures not just as these sort of accessories or these sort of idealized peasants and, enhancing the rest of the artwork, but as key components behind the composition's poetics. Similar to his German predecessors, Velasco explored the romantic relationship between human figures and the scenery they inhabit. Two indigenous individuals are presented in transit from the city to the country, reflecting a romantic yet difficult socio-economic relationship between people and their ancestral land. The figure's indigenous garments intrinsically relate to the national iconography displayed throughout the image. In the words of the German poet Johann Christoph Friedrich von Schiller, the figures in a landscape must represent a humanity reconciled with itself, nature purified, raised to its highest moral dignity, the ideal beauty applied to real life. Velasco has produced an image where national pride, romantic poetry, and daily life blend to transform the Valley of Mexico into a romantic masterpiece. All right. Here's the image in itself. So, overall, the Valley of Mexico from the hillside of Santa Isabel represents an important period in the development of Mexico's national identity and an important chapter in the history of Mexican art. Velasco's landscapes become symbols of the nation as they represented Mexico in 7 world fairs. The union of romantic European sensibilities and the historical allegories observed in his composition won him important recognition in Chicago, Paris, and Philadelphia in the late 19th century. So this is the end of our segment on photography and realism. So our next segment we'll still delve into realism a little bit, but we're also going to be moving into Impressionism. So stay tuned.